it very difficult for you to manage your pasture and crops, especially when you're applying one bland strategy. Well, Simon Mattsson has experienced grazing and cultivated crops through his family business. But it was when he began to investigate the soil impacts of growing a monoculture like sugarcane that everything changed. A Nuffield Scholarship in 2014 or 2014, for those of you who are English Nazis. Simon focused on the beneficial and predatory microbial activities and the balance of fungi and bacteria. To complete his studies, he travelled extensively through 12 countries, more notably the UK, US, Brazil, India and South Africa. As a direct result, he implemented a multi-species crop amongst his cane, yes, in the interrow to improve compaction, nutrient levels, and also address nematodes. In the years that followed, he incorporated cattle and dung beetles into his fallow management. The cattle were borrowed. And then he completed several courses, including Grazing for Profit, and in 2020 sold the family farm to pursue his passion for soil health education with soil, land, food as regenerative farming consultant. Please make him feel warmly welcome, Simon Mattsson.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Kim. I'm actually going to make Jack work for his money now because I'm not going to stand up on the stage. I'm going to keep moving around. So he's actually going to have to do something instead of being able to sit there and go to sleep. Okay. I'm going to break it up a little bit for you today as well in the fact that I'm not going to have a PowerPoint presentation. I thought perhaps we would work our way through some of the resources that Gilly so very kindly put in all your packs. So in particular, we'll be looking at this resource. So if you all want to grab this resource out of your packs, you should all have it in your packs. We need to have a bit of a look through it. It's a great resource, and I want to be able to draw your attention to some aspects of it. Righto. We've heard a bit this morning about diverse soil types, and there is a hell of a lot of them. If you just turn to page 18, for example, which is that page, this is up near Cairns. There is a whole heap of different soil types there. You can see a whole range of different colours, which each represent a different soil type. So the problem with all these different soil types, obviously, is you could have many of them and they may all need different management. Just as an example, as a personal example for you to demonstrate how important that management can be, I have distinct memories of the cattle station that my parents had in central Queensland. And the dam, or Dad actually built two 20,000 yard dams back in the mid-1970s as part of the development of that property. And one of those dams, unfortunately, was placed in a very inappropriate soil type. Knowing what I know now, I could have very easily recognised that fact just by walking across that soil. But then we didn't know. We didn't realise what we were doing. We placed that dam in what was a very sodic kind of soil. The problem with that was that the soil particles, the clay particles in particular, would always stay in suspension. It was that bad, the water in that dam never settled. It never settled. So even after months of no inflow, the water in that dam would still be cloudy to the point if you cupped it in your hand, you couldn't see your hand, even months after the last inflow. So the cattle, when we had them in that area, they would only water at that dam one day in every two. Dad realised over time that the cattle weren't doing too well, so he actually gave them access back to Eaglefield Creek, and every second day those cattle would walk the extra probably 2 kilometres to get back to the creek to have a decent drink, because the water in that dam was so bad. So you, as the owners of your land, need to be able to recognise the limitations of the various different soil types that you have. And from there be able to hopefully be able to make the appropriate changes. So I'll just bring this little slide around so that you can all have a brief look at it. This is some sodic soil, and you'll see in one corner that the crop that's planted there, it's actually a little bit of oats. Looks quite good in comparison. It's the same soil type, no difference in the soil type. There was no additional fertiliser applied anywhere in the paddock, including this little piece. And there was no additional water. There was no manure out of the yards that are just next. There was none of that. The effect that's happened in this photograph is entirely biological. The difference was an ant's nest. There's an ant's nest underneath where that good oats is. The ant's nest actually got spread out in the process of planting that paddock. So it got a little bit spread around, top knocked off it. The ants had modified that soil to the point where it would grow, obviously, quite a bit more very good oats in comparison to the rest of the paddock. So you can take a soil and quite significantly modify it with management. Another little slide for you. So these two soils are within about 3 metres of each other. So this is the wet tropics up just south of Cairns. The really dark looking soil is underneath vanilla plantation in rows of vanilla, and the lighter looking soil is just the interspace in between the rows of the vanilla. Now, what's happened here is intensive mulching, basically. And this soil, the really dark coloured soil, now has organic carbons that you wouldn't believe. So they're to the point now where you wouldn't recognise it anymore as being a tropical soil. And the only addition has been a lot of mulch over about a 10-year period. So I'm not for a moment suggesting that you can achieve this in a broad-scale grazing sense. However, it goes a little bit along the way to show you the potential of what something like ground cover can do. We've heard it mentioned today how critically important ground cover is, and if there's one thing that you as graziers can do, and that's to try and maintain ground cover. Now, if we turn in that guide that you've got, if we go towards the back of it, page 79, there's a section on tropical grazing. And there's these 5 steps, if you will, or critical things that you can do to help you maintain productivity and maintain your land and hopefully improve your soil health. So, number 1 there is maintaining that ground cover at all times. Now, I grew up, as I mentioned, in central Queensland on a medium-sized cattle station, and we certainly went through plenty of periods of drought and flooding rain. So I guess I know that it can be difficult to maintain that ground cover all year round in all years. There's always going to be environmental influences, but it's the thing that you have the most control over. I guess at the end of the day, you spent all of your money, or most of your money, buying that land. So you need to try and maintain it in as good a condition as you possibly can, surely. Now, I'm sure that in everybody's case, that's what they want to do. Think of it a bit like maintaining the cruiser or the Nissan Patrol that you use to flog around the paddocks all the time. If it's not in working condition, you're not going to go very far, are you? So, yeah, it's got to have good wheels, it's got a gearbox, it's got to work, you know, all these nice things it's got to have to make it work. Well, your soil's the same. It's got to have certain things and they've got to be maintained, otherwise your productivity and potentially your soil type, and not so much your soil type, but your ability to improve will be degraded over time. Righto. Christine has mentioned soil tests. And to a point, I agree with Christine in that fact that soil tests can be, how do you put it, sometimes not really helpful. But in my opinion, and unfortunately or fortunately, it's now legislation whereby everybody here on the from Mackay North has to take a soil sample to be able to grow cane and buy fertiliser, and a lot of the graziers will be forced into doing the same thing as well over time. Now, one soil sample can be more problem than it's worth, but you have to start somewhere. And I guess without a soil sample, you're entirely guessing. With a soil sample, I guess it's what you'd call educated guessing. And then if you maintain your records and keep your soil samples and build them up over time, that's when they actually become useful. So over a number of years, taking soil samples in the same parts of your paddock, in your same soil types, remembering that you really need to take soil samples by soil type. And I've got a little handout here. There's not... I misunderstood the program and I thought I'd only be speaking to roughly half of you. So I didn't print extra of these. So I haven't got enough for everybody, but we'll hand them around anyway. It's just this little handout's 3 reasons for getting a soil test and the golden rules for using a soil test. So, yeah, if you just want to hand them out, thanks, Gilly. So, using these soil tests over time, you can get a much better idea of the limitations of your various different soil types. As I mentioned, you've got to take a sample by soil type. And soil samples are not that expensive. So you may need to take 10 soil samples to get all the different soil types that you have in your property. You may need to take 1 or 2, or you may just decide you're going to concentrate on your best country or your worst country and only soil sample that. That's entirely up to you, but the point of it is, for me, is that these soil samples need to be taken correctly because you can really stuff it up. And there is some good resources out there to show you and help you in taking soil samples. You don't need to rely on someone like me or an agronomist to come and take soil samples for you. If you go to something like the EAL website, for instance, or to Soil Land Foods website, there's some really good little short YouTube clips there and information on those sites that'll explain to you how to take your own soil samples, where to send it, and what to ask for. I guess, as far as I'm concerned, these days, I think the onus is on you as the landholder to actually get to the point where you can read your own soil samples, not so much maybe to fully understand them, but to know the basics, to really be able to say, okay, I understand what pH means. I understand what carbon-nitrogen ratio means. Some of those basic things. Thank you. As it turns out, you can do courses these days to actually learn some of this stuff. Dave and I do them, and there's other people that actually give courses on occasions to learn how to do something like reading soil samples. Yes. So it's a very good point, Sharon, thank you. When you're taking your soil samples, choose a laboratory and stick to it. You have to make sure that laboratory's accredited, nationally accredited, and most of them are. And you pick a laboratory and stick to it. That way you're comparing apples to apples in the years to come. So for instance, if I just touch on phosphorus for a moment, phosphorus can be measured in many different ways. Typically, on more alkaline soils, Olsen P is the method used, but up here in the tropics we tend to use Colwall P, or we actually have to use BSES P. So those are just the methods that are three of the methods that phosphorus is measured with. And those methods are either relevant or not so relevant to your particular district. So you do need to know a little bit about that kind of stuff so that you are asking for the right thing. And then hopefully over time you can get to the point where you can have a conversation with your agronomist and understand the basics to the point where you can challenge him or her around the more important aspects of your soil. So I'm not so much referring to nutrients. We all just jump to nutrients as the answer. We need to add more of this or more of that or more of the other, micronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus. But think of your soil sample as more telling the story for you of those other things within your soil that will largely outline your underlying soil constraints. Something like sodicity, or salinity. And I guess in my case, on the cane farm, I used them largely to help me with levels of carbon. So this is another very good way that you can hopefully help you monitor how your improvements, how your management over time is improving your soil. So we all like to know that we're gaining ground, doing a good job, actually making a difference. And one of those ways that we can measure that is through our soil samples, with things like measuring organic carbon. So if your organic carbons are rising, well then hopefully your management practices are actually helping to do that. But obviously if they're static or still falling, it's an indicator that you're not doing so well. Then there's plenty of ways you can measure your soil health in the field. There's plenty of us, most of us know what a shovel looks like, but frequently most of us never even use it. Maybe it's because we don't know where the starter switch is. But get a shovel, go out in the paddock, when you can get it in the ground that is, dig up a cube of soil and have a bit of a look through it. So this is a resource, another resource that's available on the internet or via Soil Land Food. It's a little resource that David Hardwick wrote, and it gives you a whole heap of practical ways of measuring your soil health in the field, so you don't have to send stuff away. And you really need to be able to do that. You need to be able to measure your ground cover. That's something we heard about from this morning. Being able to take a ground cover measurement, see what's there. So yeah, a little bit of self-education always helps. I guess that's what you're here doing today. Righto. In your packs, there's another little resource, and there's also a bigger version of it, and it's online as well, and it's supposed to be online with the Central Queensland Soil Health Systems, the local soil health group as well. It's my experience over the last decade or so of multi-species cover cropping and intercropping in cane. So when it comes to setting yourself up and then hopefully getting something in the ground and monitoring your results and seeing a result that you want, hopefully you'll be able to get something out of this manual to help you through that journey. So there is 20 different species in here, including Christine's favourite, Chicory. So over the last 15 or so years, I've played with about 40 different species of plant, and some of those species, 5 or 6 different varieties of those species. So sometimes when you want to try a plant species, quite often, the first time you try it, it won't be necessarily successful because we can't try every variety, obviously. So what I normally do when I'm trying a new plant species is I'll try it 3 years in a row, and I'll try 3 different varieties of that plant species. And if it fails each time, then I'm thinking, yeah, maybe it's not such a good plant species for my environment. Remembering that I'm doing this in a polyculture situation, not so much in a monoculture situation. There's plenty of information, as was mentioned earlier, out there on the internet when it comes to growing a whole heap range of species. There's plenty of information there, but it's primarily just based on monoculture situations. Your seed companies are used to selling seed one species at a time. They're not used to selling it in multiples of different species. That's something that's coming. It's something that's already here. Our speaker after lunch will be able to tell you all about it. So there are people in Australia now that have got their head around mixing different species together and what may and may not work. There's much more information on the internet about what's been done in the US in particular, or in Europe, or in South America. But the principles are still the same and still apply. It doesn't matter where that was developed. So I guess if you consider a good idea somewhere, it's probably a good idea everywhere, but it's all about you adapting that idea to make it fit within your economic circumstances and within your environment. And multi-species cover cropping or intercropping or adding extra species to pasture is definitely a good idea. I think you've probably got the drift today that it's a good idea. Every speaker you'll hear from reckons it's a good idea, and all of us have had plenty of experience doing it. But you're going to have to go on that journey for yourselves and work out how to make it work for yourself within your own patch. So a strategy that I would encourage you to do in the early stages is to not get too wound up in the hype around certain species. If I had to pick on a particular species that really gets a lot of hype, it would be tillage radish, for example. Now, tillage radish is just a daikon radish. It means it's got a big tuber. And there's plenty of daikon radishes on the market, plenty of different kinds of daikon radish that aren't called tillage radish. But they're still a daikon, so they still have a big tuber. And quite often that seed's a fair bit cheaper than buying tillage radish seed is, for example. Another one that gets a lot of hype is sun hemp, which is not a hemp at all. It's actually a crotalaea. And there's plenty of native crotalaeas in this country. So sun hemp can do a job for you. Seed's rather expensive, and it's pretty much all imported. There's a bit of an issue in this country with growing sun hemp successfully for seed. So, yeah, do you need sun hemp? It may be a nice addition, but it probably isn't your go-to straight up, first up, so to speak, when you're still trying to learn what you're doing. So I would encourage you to not so much try big, complicated mixes in the first couple of years, but concentrate on those species that are much more reliable. If we just look at my experience within this local district, sunflowers will grow pretty much all year round. Japanese millet, sorghum, chicory, and then you've got cowpeas, lab, soybeans. Those are the species, and they're all annuals. Those are the species that I know I could plant in pretty much any season locally, and they're going to grow for me. They're going to give me a result. They're going to help me on that journey of reassuring myself that I'm on the right path. And we all need to do that. You need to get some wins. There's nothing worse than spending $100 a hectare on seed on a 15 Weibix and then only being able to find 3 or 4 of those and think, oh, bloody hell, if I'd only bought those 3 or 4, I could have saved $70 and had the same result. So as your soil improves and your experience and knowledge of what you're doing improves, you'll be able to get to the point where you're utilising all of those fancy fandangled plant species. But in the early stages, probably you could spend a lot of money and not get the satisfaction that you're looking for out of it. A lot of our soils are fairly well challenged at this point in time. And you really need to build that soil to get some diversity in there to help you build that soil and improve it over time so that you can earn the right to grow some of those species. Phacelia was mentioned earlier today. I love Phacelia. It's a very pretty flower. But it will grow here. Seed can be a little bit difficult to get. It's a C3, so it's a temperate species. It grows here quite well in winter. But I really think it's a classic for you. It's a classic species that you need to earn the right to grow, if you will. It struggles in our environment when in such challenged soil conditions that we're facing with at this point in time. In 3 or 4 or 5, 6 years' time, as you get down the track and improve your organic carbons a little bit and improve your biological function a little bit, that's when a species like Phacelia can come to the fore and you really get some economic benefit out of it being in your mix. You'll see it's in my list of 20. It's there, but I wouldn't, if you've never done this before, I would not have it in the first year. No way. Like I said, you need to give yourself some confidence. Yeah, please.
When it comes to reseeding your patch that you've just planted,
Yep.
that's the concept, is for it to reseed before cattle go in. Oh, sorry.
Would you like to?
Is that on? Yep.
having that multi-species reseed before stock go in there,
Yep.
so you can be reassured you've got another hit, because you don't want them to eat the multi-species and that's it. There's your annual gone. So we're talking about multi-species that can reseed quite readily.
Yep. Okay. Grazing management is as critical as planting the multi-species cover crop in the first place. And I think we've heard that already this morning. If you don't manage your plant species and know what their limitations are, you can spend a lot of money on seed and ruin it in the first couple of months. And there's some of those hints in that little multi-species cover cropping guide I've got there. I think I've put down some of the limitations I've discovered on those species. Chicory is a classic example. So while chicory is a highly beneficial plant species within our systems, and I think it grows here quite nicely, it struggles during the summer, but I have seen plants that are able to over summer and make it to the next winter and continue to grow and seed again. Its limitation is if the cattle chew the crown of the plant off, you've just killed the plant. It's gone. So you have to, this is where some of that complexity comes in your management. You have to know these things about your plant species so that you can manage your grazing to make sure that they're not going to kill your chicory the first time they graze the paddock. But I think you already know a little bit of this because legumes, for instance, where a lot of us are used to planting legumes in our pastures and have been doing it for yonks. But typically we find that our legumes don't persist very well. Some of that it comes from the fact that those legumes are probably more palatable or particularly have more protein in them than our grass at many different stages during the year. So the cattle return to them quite often to nibble them off. And then we'll have a dry spell and those legumes have all been chewed down to the point where they're basically a stump and there's not much more. And the cattle, we've taken them out sort of thing or whatever, and the cattle aren't grazing them again. And then we get a rainfall event and all those legumes shoot nicely and they've got this much green growth on them, look pretty good. Cattle come back in and the first thing they do is go to that legume, they grab hold of it with their mouth in one chomp and pull the whole thing out the ground. Because, remember, earlier today we talked about the fact that these plant species, when they're chewed down, they slough off a lot of their roots. So that poor plant has lost most of its root system. It's had a bit of rain. It's trying to re-establish its root system because that's what held it in the ground when the cow was there last, when the soil was dry. But all of a sudden it hasn't got so much of a root system. The soil's wet and out it comes. So frequently I think we lose our legumes in particular and our forbs at a very high rate straight after a rainfall event.
Are you happy to take some questions soon? Is there anything else you wanted to add before we move to that?
As you know, Kim, I could go on all day long. So we better have these questions, I guess. Well,
you will have time to be accosted by people over lunch. So, yes, I highly encourage you to tackle Simon if you'd like to, confront him one-on-one. But does anyone have some public questions that everyone would benefit from?
Just a question about your soil sampling. Are you talking about core samples or your topsoil samples or a mixture of both?
I'm really only talking about topsoil samples, top 20 centimetres. That's where the action is from a production point of view. So I'm not talking about taking carbon samples down to a metre. So yeah, I'm concentrating more on the topsoil, definitely. There is, well, and we'll hear from Grant a little bit later on about bioferments, we've heard a little bit about it this morning. Biofertilizers, so you can make your own. I actually run courses to do that. So there is ways to make your own. Grant makes, how much do you make, Grant, a year? 200,000 litres. So yeah, it's perfectly viable to make large amounts of it. In a grazing system, you probably don't need to make that much of it. We're all busy people, but the thing that it will be really beneficial for you is when you're planting, is to be able to put a little bit out when you're planting. So perhaps you don't need to make huge amounts.
Any more questions about specifics in relation to what Simon's been presenting in multi-species soil samples?
I have a few more little resources here. There's one for products for increasing soil mineral fertility. Your basic stuffs like lime and gypsum. What do those things do for your soil? Choosing different fertiliser products, a little handout on soil organisms, that sort of thing. So yeah, if you want a little bit more information or a take home to help you remember tomorrow, the next day, next week, next year, yeah, come and see me.
I have one little question. We've had a little bit of information about weeds and the fact that they can tell you something, and Grant might mention more of this in his little talk, but if you've got a woody weed that's got a long taproot, that's signifying that maybe you should be looking at planting something similar in a more beneficial species. So from your soil sampling, what can you tell if there are weeds where you would normally want some sort of ground cover, just anecdotally? Because you know I'm growing a multi-species cover crop of weeds at the moment.
Yeah.
It's a healthy selection, thank you.
Quite often your weeds can be indicator species. So they are on some occasions indicating underlying soil health issues. And you can sometimes get them leaf analysed to give you an indication of what that may be. This is a little bit problematic in the fact that a lot of the weed species, your laboratories do not have good benchmarks for those weed species. So quite often they can't tell you if those mineral levels within the plant tissue is good, bad or indifferent. However, they can tell you what is actually in those leaf that you send them. So it could be quite a good way of diagnosing potentially an underlying condition that you potentially could fix. So yeah, your weeds can be indicator species as they're called, and there is a couple of very good publications out there around using weeds as indicators and trying to address some of those underlying soil constraints.
Yeah, I think we talked about if weeds could talk or when weeds talk yesterday. However, I noticed it's a US publication. I'm wondering, do we get the same weeds in this country? All right, questions, woohoo!
Yeah, Simon, just a question on the dam you built. You said it never cleared up down here back.
Oh.
What would have happened if you would have tanked that water and then put it into a trough?
So I don't remember that we ever put a tank on that dam, Dad, but I certainly saw water sitting in a trough, that was not being drunk by cattle over an extended period of time. And yeah, it settled to a point. Like in the bottom of the trough, there was this sludge that would be 6 inches deep. So it did, if it was left totally undisturbed, settle to some extent. But it never got to the point where I thought I could drink that. Never. And that's just a classic of a really highly sadistic, sodic soil, sorry. It was pretty sadistic, I thought, to us, to the cows drinking it. But yeah, it's just a classic example of recognising a soil constraint by soil type, and then being able to make adjustments to what you do. So that applies to your planting a multi-species sort of thing. You will have soil types that are highly acidic for instance, or fairly alkaline, for instance. And there's definitely plant species that do better in acidic conditions than they will in alkaline conditions. So you need to know those underlying soil constraints. It will help you in choosing the right number or the right different species to go in your soil type. It's at least a starting point for you.
Final question. Oh,
Um,
maybe second last.
Back to the weed thing. Cattle like to eat weeds. At certain times of year, they might need to hay off. You might have other species eating weeds, like kangaroos or
Yep.
parrots. You don't want to delete all the, ecological cycle by thinking that's not looking very good. I think I'll get rid of that. But by slashing, perhaps, if you really feel it's a problem, only for it to probably come back next year, but would be a way of covering your country if that's the only thing growing there. So you're still doing a multi-purpose thing with it.
Okay. Anything that's palatable in a grazing situation, I don't consider a weed. If it's palatable at any stage during its growth period, doesn't matter whether it's really small or really big or somewhere in between, if it's palatable and the cattle are eating it, then it's not a weed. Might look a little ugly, sticking up there in the middle of your nice, even pasture. We have to get around that. We have to, if you're going to seriously consider using a multi-species anything, for it doesn't matter if it's grazing or intercropping in cane or in grain crops or whatever, you have to get away from the idea that things need to look neat. Mother Nature does not do neat. It absolutely doesn't do neat. So you need to be able to accept the fact that things might look a little ugly sometimes during the year and just be able to say, okay, I know the cows can eat that in 3 months' time. So, yeah, it can stay there. It's not doing any harm. However, slashing, for instance, or mulching is even better, can be a great way of topping a pasture so that it maybe looks a little bit more appealing to us or those people driving past on the road that think you're doing a lousy job. But mulching, for instance, can also help your soil health because you're using that weed, or something you think is a weed, and you're chopping it off and you're placing it back on the ground where it can be consumed by your microbes, so it serves its purpose that way instead of maybe being much of your actual pasture. So yeah, mulching is better than slashing because it spreads it out more evenly. But if you haven't got a mulcher, you only got a slasher, maybe just cut high and spread it that way. Yep.
Hi, I was just interested in the idea of plant tissue sampling you're talking about. Wondering, you said the baselines for weeds aren't great. Is there much available, or is it very useful to do crop plant tissue sampling? Would that tell you something about your soil constraints? Like I'm thinking, when you do cane farming, would it be useful in our last ratoon cane to do a plant tissue sample of the old cane before we harvest it? Would that tell us something about how then to treat that in fallow?
A tissue sample is a little bit different to a sap sample, so you can do 2 different samples on your plant tissue. So in horticulture, tissue and sap samples are used every day to guide a nutrition program, without a doubt. Using it in cane is a little bit more difficult, if you will. So in horticulture, most of that tissue and sap sampling is being done on annual plants. Some is tree crops as well, yes, at certain stages. But mostly in annuals. And you got to remember sugarcane is perennial, C4 tropical grass. And soil sampling, the tissue sampling you would have to be very precise in where you're sampling, so to speak, to get an indication of what you may need to do to increased productivity. So, yes, I tried doing this, exactly what you're suggesting in cane, but I guess I wasn't able to successfully translate that into a productive gain based on fertiliser applications, as you're suggesting, from tissue sampling. However, if you combine tissue sampling with soil sampling in cane, then I think, yes, you can really start to get a much better picture of where you could go to. But once again, you need to set trends over time. I wouldn't take just one soil sample and one leaf sample and combine those two and think I had a definite route.
A legal question from over here.
Yeah, I've heard where they took a plant sample of the crop they were trying to grow and where the weed was growing really well, and then an area where the weed wasn't growing as well and the crop was growing real well, and then compared the two, and that's how they used the weed and, compared the levels, found out what was deficient or sufficient in like that. Yep.
So I think that could work quite well. But you have to know how to take the samples. It doesn't matter if it's a soil sample or if it's a tissue sample. You have to know how to take it to be able to get reliable or semi-reliable results. As Christine mentioned, they're not terribly reliable, and even doing like you suggest and only doing it once and then basing a major economic decision on that one sample can really set you up for a failure. But if you did that consistently over a number of years, then I think you could really nail down a nutrition program based on that kind of sampling. Same as I mentioned before with soil sampling, tissue sampling, and in our cattle we can sample dung, do dung and hair samples. So the same thing applies in cattle production. You can really get an idea of the nutrition value of your feed by doing dung and hair samples over time. They're a bit like sap and tissue samples in our plant sampling. So you can use that to get an idea of if your pasture is on the improve or waning or whatever. So yeah, a lot of the time these samples don't cost a lot of money. They can be very confusing, yes, but their power comes over time when you build up a library, and then you can really pick the trends for your different soil types. That's where the power really comes. And in your own experience and knowledge, learning how to read the basics. By the basics, I mean just recognising if you're improving pH and carbon levels or carbon and nitrogen levels, that sort of thing. Not in your ability to try and say, okay, I need this much phosphorus or I need this much, whatever it is.
Thank you very much, Simon. I will interrupt this thought now so that we can move on. However, I want to make mention, Shelley Malloy just came up to me from the Mackay Regional Council and said, it's all very well and good that, some weeds can be consumed, but there are noxious and declared pest weeds that shouldn't be, one of them being sickle pod. So if you'd like more information about the declared weeds in your region and what the council can do to help you, because I've had them on my property. In fact, Shelley and I had a splatter gun on our property to help us with some of the lantana issues many, many years ago when I was on the ABC, and we used to do quite frequent talks about the equipment they have to loan to you and the ways they can assist you in identifying any of those declared weeds. So please go and see Shelley while she's here to talk to her about what weeds of concern you may have and how they can help you maybe not have your cattle eat them and spread them around.